All right. Hey, comrades. Welcome to the fourth meeting of Liberation School's course on Volume 1 of Marx's Capital. I'm Marisa Lee Sanchez, a PSL member in New York City and a member of the Liberation School's editorial collective. So the PSL is hosting this course because Capital is a book that many activists and organizers want to read, but often find the process of doing so daunting. And while there are valuable resources for helping work through capital, most of them are from academics who aren't thinking about the day-to-day concerns of organizers in the struggle. So what we wanted to do with this collective reading is to give it from our perspective, the perspective of those committed to advancing the struggle worldwide for socialism and liberation. And in today's class, we'll be covering chapters 4 through 9 of the text. So one thing with that is, as a reminder, the pages cited in the slideshow coming up do refer to 3 different versions of the text. The first is the online version, the second is the International Publishers version, and the third is the Penguin version. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over now to Derek Ford. Derek is a PSL member in Indianapolis and editor of Liberation School. And then afterwards, I'll facilitate the question and answer. All right, Derek, thank you.
Thanks, Marisa, and welcome, comrades, to Class 4. We'll be discussing chapters 4 through 9. Hopefully you found them a little bit easier because by now you're used to Marx's writing style and you're familiar with some of the concepts that he is now building on, elaborating, and adding to. So let me just share this screen real quick. Sorry, this is taking me longer than usual. All right, cool. So just to review real quickly, a commodity is in the form of society we're considering is a contradictory unity of use value and exchange value. And exchange value is only possible because there is some common substance within the commodity, although it's an immaterial substance, and that is labor power, or more precisely, socially necessary labor time, which is abstract labor power. Use value is qualitative, it's in the commodity, and it's realized through consumption. Exchange value is quantitative, it's not located in the commodity, it's a relation between different commodities, and it's realized through exchange. Value is a dynamic social relation. It changes with the different factors that go into the socially necessary labor time. And as exchange develops, one commodity becomes the general equivalent, gold or money. Money has several functions, as we talked about in the last class, as a measure of value, as a means of circulation, and as a means of payment. And we went over some of the contradictions within and between these different functions. And I think the last thing is that whereas direct commodity exchange is immediate, when money is introduced, so CC becomes CMC, it breaks up the sequence in space and in time. And so you can sell one commodity in one moment, in one place, and then you can use the money to buy other commodities in another time, in another place. And this is what helps circulation burst through local bounds and allows for endless accumulation, because you can accumulate infinite money, theoretically anyways, but you can't accumulate infinite use values. So the general formula for capital. Marx notes here that money is the first form of capital, and this is a necessary sort of prerequisite for capitalism because, well, under feudalism, land is a form of capital, but land is unable to facilitate exchange, and it's literally locked in place, right? Unlike money, which is able to burst through local bounds. And this is important because it shows one of the ways that capital is able to overcome feudalism because it has fewer limitations. It's not bound to time and place. It can transcend those And so it has more flexibility and more mobility, more dynamism than feudalism does. Obviously, if land is still important under capitalism, and because of land's unique properties, it represents sort of a unique form of capital that Marx will take up in the third volume, where he'll distinguish between differential rent 1 and 2, and there's some sort of sub-distinctions within that. So not all money is capital, right? And not all capital is money. Money is money when it's being used for exchange, and money is capital when it's being used to produce new values, right? And so the difference is rooted in the form of circulation. CMC, it's money, but MCM, as we will see, is capital. And money is the final result of this process of circulation, and it's a starting point of capitalism. It's the first form under which capital appears. So let's go through some of the differences between CMC and MCM, because I think that it really helps draw out the real systemic, qualitative differences between these two circuits of capital, even though CMC is a circuit of capital. Okay, so under CMC, you're selling in order to buy, right? So a commodity is at the beginning and the end of the process. And the circuit is driven by use values, right? You're selling a commodity to get an exchange value, but you're doing that so that you can then procure another use value, right? So money is the means to change different use values. So in this way, exchange value is still there, but it's subordinate to use value. The other thing is that the money is spent in the circuit, right? And the circuit ends with the consumption of the final commodity, right? Of course, it splits up. So one CM becomes another MC, which can then become another CM. And the beginning and end points are distinct, right? You can tell the difference between the starting commodity and the commodity that you end up with, because you don't go through this in order to get the exact same thing, right? So MCM is really the opposite. It's buying in order to sell. So money is at the beginning and end of the process, which means the exchange value drives the circuit, right? It's not motivated by any particular use value. It doesn't really matter what C is. What really matters is the end result of M. And the commodity is the means to exchange different money, right? And this means that the money is advanced. So it's not spent, it's advanced, which means that it will come back in a different form. The circuit also has no limits. It doesn't have an end. Marx here writes, one of the many places he does, that capital has no limits. Of course, it has many limits, but sort of theoretically, it doesn't have any limits. And in effect, a lot of histories of capitalism have to do with figuring out or realizing different ways that capital overcomes the very barriers that it puts into place. The other thing here is that you can't really distinguish between the beginning and the end, right? It looks like you're just exchanging money for money, right? Or money for more money, obviously. And you can't tell the initial sum of money from the final sum of money apart, right? Because it's actually different money, right? I mean, physically it's different money, and you can't, it just looks like money is growing. And we get to the beginning definitions of capital and the capitalist here. The circulation of money as capital is an end for the expansion of value, takes place only within this constantly renewed movement. The circulation of capital, therefore, has no limits. MCM becomes the capitalist's subjective aim, and it is only insofar as the appropriation of ever more and more wealth in the abstract becomes the sole motive of his operations that he functions as a capitalist, that is, as capital personified and endowed with consciousness and a will. And remember, Marx is here referring to one's structural position within society, not their sort of unique individual attributes, right? Their role as a capitalist. Use values are therefore not the real aim of the capitalist, right? Neither is the profit of any single transaction. It's really the restless, never-ending process of profit-making alone that's aimed at. This is boundless greed after riches. And it's common to the capitalist and the miser, but while the miser is merely a capitalist gone mad, the capitalist is a rational miser. So in other words, the miser is one who accumulates basically in order to hoard, and that would be a capitalist sort of gone mad in the sense that the drive to accumulate is there, but it's an incorrect expression of that. Whereas the capitalist is a rational miser because the capitalist knows that it is not just by accumulating that you accumulate, but it's also by advancing money in the circulation process. Sorry. Okay. And then because you can't tell the end and the starting point of MCM apart, it looks like money is just growing more money, right? In truth, value is the active factor in the process, in which, while constantly assuming the form in turn of money and commodities, it at the same time changes in magnitude. It differentiates itself by throwing off surplus value from itself. The original value, in other words, expands spontaneously. For the movement in the course of which it adds surplus value is its own movement. Its expansion, therefore, is automatic expansion. Because it is value, it has acquired the occult quality of being able to add value to itself. It brings forth living offspring, or at the least lays golden eggs, right? And of course, Marx is saying here that it acquires an occult quality. It doesn't actually lay magic eggs, right? And the whole purpose of capital is to show us how surplus value is produced, what the actual production process looks like. But it looks like M to M. And it also looks like M to M, for the capitalists themselves. And this is one way in which the capitalist relations of exploitation aren't immediately apparent to the capitalist, because they're not able to really see the difference. They're not really able to see the actual production of surplus value and how that manifests itself, because they're just thinking like, I'm starting with this amount of money and I got this amount of money to make at the end. And that's really the whole thing, right? And whatever else you're doing in the meantime, like, I don't really care as long as it's making me more money, right? Because the actual use values are no consideration to the capitalist, right? As long as they can command an exchange value on the market, right? And this is not just for merchant capital, right? Which is when, merchants capital is, you buy commodities and then you sell them. So, stores are forms of merchant capital. And it's also for industrial capital, which is basically like productive capital. So where the production of surplus value takes place. I gave a couple definitions here of the different kinds of capital. These come in the introduction of volume 2, where Marx breaks up the MCM circuit further and sort of expands it and shows the different phases, because there's like the financing of capital, which is, the advancing, the bank giving a loan to the capitalist, and then the capitalist actually, gets the raw materials, organizes the workers under his command, and then sells it usually to commodity capital, commercial capital, right? So the owners of transportation, storage, and distribution. So merchants capital, sort of like in the old days, the merchants were those who would just buy and sell. Today, merchants capital is really like finance capital. Okay, and then we get to the contradictions in the general formula of capital. And this is, pretty straightforward. Basically, like, we're talking about MCM. And what's interesting here is that neither A nor B, those who are involved, those who have the money or the commodity, see the capitalist as a capitalist. They're just the owner of money, right? And so therefore, merely flipping CMC and MCM doesn't tell us anything about capital, right? Sure, regarding use value, both parties seem to gain something out of this. But this itself isn't the production of new value, it's merely transferring existing values, right? So Marx's question, is there anything in the simple circulation of capital that can explain the expansion of value? Because obviously the capitalist is not gonna throw money into circulation unless they can get more money in the end, right? And he goes through several different scenarios and basically, says that none of these end up really producing any new value. They're really just a way for the existing value to be sort of redistributed, right? So like if I raise the price of my commodity 10% above the value, I'm going to get more money than others, but unless we're actually producing new value, that 10% is just going to manifest itself in a 10% decrease of another capitalist, right? You can also have a class that only consumes and doesn't produce, like who live off taxes, right? Government officials, for example. But that again doesn't explain the production of value. And if we assume we're dealing with individuals and not personifications of economic relations, that also doesn't explain it, right? It's just one person sort of getting over on another, but it's not adding any value. It's again just redistributing the existing values. Okay, so circulation can't explain surplus value, right? Surplus value doesn't come from circulation. There's no new value produced in the circulation process itself, right? It's the exchange of equivalents. But surplus value also can arise outside of circulation. So Marx writes, our friend Moneybags, who as yet is only an embryo capitalist, must buy his commodities at their value, must sell them at their value, and yet at the end of the process must withdraw more value from circulation than he threw into it at starting. His development into a full-grown capitalist must take place both within the sphere of circulation and without it. These are the conditions of the problem, hic Rhodus, hic salta, right? So here is Rhodes, jump, right? So it's sort of the conclusion of the chapter. Like this is it. This is a sort of contradiction. Like it can arise, it doesn't arise within it and it doesn't arise without it. It really does both, right? It's really inside of circulation and outside of circulation. And in order to make this clear, he's gonna tell us more about that particular commodity that allows this to happen, right? And just one note, Moneybags is in the original translation, the International Publishers Edition, but in the Penguin edition, I think it's just the capitalist. So you lose a little bit of Marx's sort of literary flair and humor. All right, so chapter 6, the buying and selling of labor power. All right, the creation of value has to take place in the first act. It has to be someplace in M to C, right? Because when you go from C to M, that's sort of the pure exchange. Okay? So Moneybags has to be so lucky as to find in circulation a commodity whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being a source of value, whose actual consumption, therefore, is itself an embodiment of labor and consequently a creation of value, right? And so this is labor power. That's that commodity. And so if you remember in the beginning of the book, like the first page, Marx was like, the use value of commodities doesn't really concern us at all. That's the work of history. But the whole sort of crux of this issue really hinges on the distinction between the use value of labor power and the exchange value of labor power, which is really what we're discussing today. And Marx defines labor power as a capacity for labor is to be understood the aggregate of those mental and physical capabilities existing in a human being, which they exercise whenever they produce a use value of any description, right? So it's mental and it's physical. It could also be, I think physical, both of these basically also encompass like emotional or affective labor, basically any kind of, intentional labor used to produce a use value, really whether that use value is like a sort of tangible commodity or an immaterial commodity, like a service or something. Okay. And so this is what labor power is. We'll get more into this later on today. But then how is it that labor power comes to appear on the market? This is going to be revisited in the end of the book, where we get more to the actual the historical mechanisms of how labor power came to be. Right here, we're in a bit of a sort of like theoretical exposition, right? So the first thing is that labor power has to be under the control of the worker, right? Because they have to meet each other on the market as equals. Right? So the labor power that I sell I have to be able to sell it, right? And this is, again, why slavery and capitalism, while they can absolutely coexist, and we'll discuss that a lot more in the next class when we talk about chapter 10, they're ultimately sort of like, they're different social systems of production, because slavery isn't a form of labor power, right? It is a form of labor, but not labor power. So the labor power has to be mine to sell, because we have to abide by the, legal contracts of liberal political economy. And there has to be a proletariat. There has to be a class that's compelled to sell labor power. So it's not enough that I have labor power. I have to actually be forced to sell it in order to get something else. And then Marx says that the laborer is free under capitalism in two kinds of ways, neither of which are very good. They're free to sell their labor power, but they also have to be free from the means of production, which is why they're compelled to sell their labor power, because they can't use it on their own, right? These are historical conditions, right? So there's nothing that is innate in humanity that makes labor power into a commodity. It hasn't always been a commodity. It won't always be a commodity. There's no natural basis for it, right? And neither is its social basis common to all historical periods, right? It is clearly the result of a past historical development, the product of many economic revolutions, of the extinction of a whole series of older forms of social production. And this, this bit about being compelled to sell, it's really about dispossession, right? The theft of land, of resources, murder, genocide, colonialism, and all of these we'll get to at the end of the book. Okay, so commodity production and money in all its forms can exist in various economic historical configuration. But with capital, it can spring into life only when the owner of the means of production and subsistence meets in the market with the free laborer selling their labor power. And this one historical condition comprises a world's history, the history of capital. Capital, therefore, announces from its first appearance a new epoch in the process of social production. So it's not just an economic exchange, it's a social exchange, because it's not just about what goes on in circulation, it's about the social conditions necessary that enable that circulation. Right? So what is the value of labor power? Well, we know that value is socially necessary labor time, and so the value of labor power is the socially necessary labor time required to produce and reproduce labor power, right? So education, training, housing, domestic work, reproductive labor, and all of its facets, food, drink, it all goes into this, right? How is this value determined? Marx says Marx says that there's natural and historical elements. The historical element, it's class struggle, right? And also cultural norms. So really the value of labor power, it's not just about supply and demand, it's about the state of the class struggle in any given country or location. Right? In general, the value of labor power is a combination of those commodities necessary for the reproduction of the worker, right? So it's like a definite bundle of commodities that he's referring to. And you can sort of locate these at any point in time, right? So like housing, whatever. And when we make arguments for living wages, this is what we're doing, right? We're saying, well, housing costs this much in this city, transportation costs this much in this city, food and drink, education, all of that. And so all of that factors into what we think about as a living wage or a fair wage, right? Because, well, and again, so this is a dynamic situation, right? Because if the value of food falls, for example, right? If the socially necessary labor time required to produce a food staple decreases, the value will fall. And if your wage stays the same, then that means you can buy more food, right? And there's a whole lot that goes into this, and different ways that capital has sort of messed with this to get the upper hand in the class struggle, and other ways that workers have fought back to reclaim the upper hand in the class struggle. The other thing I think that's important is in this definition of the value of labor power is that it's not just economic, it's also superstructural, it's cultural, right? Because if you have a class struggle, a history of class struggle, then there are different cultural norms and expectations about what a worker should live like, what resources they should have access to. And so then those change our ideas about like what a fair wage is, right? And what we should actually struggle for, because there's a baseline that we have struggled for, right? We defend it. But then if we do that long enough, then it sort of diffuses throughout society a whole set of ideas about what the working class, what standard of living the working class should have, right? And this is also, of course, why there are, one of the reasons why capital relies so relentlessly upon divisions within the working class, because it then will then be able to sort of set apart the different values, right? To differentiate the value of labor power between different races, nationalities, genders, abilities of workers. It's the socially necessary labor time for its production and reproduction, right? So education is really important in this, especially now, right? In order to modify the human organism so that it may acquire skill and handiness in a given branch of industry and become labor power of a special kind, in particular concrete labor power, there's training and education required, right? And so this will factor into it. The expenses of education should go into the value of labor power, right? And so in this sense, really we can make an argument for free education that capitalists through their taxes should pay for free education because it's the value of labor power, right? Why is it that I have to pay to develop a labor power for you to exploit, right? And if we're operating according to the like exchange laws of liberal, neoliberal political economy or whatever, then technically I think it makes sense on those grounds that capitalists should have to pay for education, right? Just like they should have to pay, it should be sort of factored into the wage, not just the own workers' education, but also that of their children, right? In terms of reproduction. And so then when we do have to pay for our own education, that means that the price of labor power is below its value, right? And we are basically subsidizing the capitalist in that instance, right? Other times when, the minimum limit to the value of labor power is like, the minimum required to survive and show up at work the next day, right? But it obviously can go below this limit and does, right? There's a whole bunch of labor powers that are priced below their value. Whenever you read about Walmart workers, Target workers working 40 hours a week, but they're also on food stamps and other government programs, that's basically the government subsidizing the capitalists, right? Making up the difference between the price that they're paying labor power and the value of their labor power, right? So it's basically a government subsidization of capital. And this is how the state intervenes or can intervene. And so this also then, bolsters arguments for the fight for 15, or 20 or whatever it is, right? The living wage, because it's like, well, you know, the price is way below the value and these are the values. So you need to pay this value, right? Because we're supposed to be paying for, you know, for what we get. And if the capitalist gets labor power with all of this training, it should have to pay for that. Just like, you know, I mean, workers don't have any power individually to, you know, to just like reduce the price that they buy, you know, I don't know, computers at below their value, right? And again, this is a collective process of struggle that really determines this. The labor power commodity is a very unique one, right? I mean, for one, Marx says that the worker gives it on credit to the capitalist because you get paid at the end of the week. You don't get paid at the beginning of the week. And that's kind of exceptional, right? I think utilities are the only other thing really where like you get the bill at the end of the month. But like rent, you pay your rent for July on the 1st of July, right? When you go to the store, you pay for whatever you buy right there. You don't pay for it when it's all done, right? When you've used it all, right? So that's unique. The other thing is, of course, that it's attached to a person, and that's very important. That's a big problem for capitalism, and that's a big benefit for the working class. And the price is set before it's consumed, right? Like every other commodity, but its use value is the ability to produce value, right? And this is separated by an interval in time. So you buy the labor power, the contract, right? You sign for work is, you know, whatever, day 1. And you get paid day 14 according to that contract, unless there's wage theft going on. But there's going to be an intense struggle over how to use that labor power within the allotted time under the contract, right? And that's going to be really important in the next class. So what does the consumption of the use value of labor power look like? It's completed outside the limits of the market, right? It's consumed not in the circulation process, in the production process. So accompanied by Mr. Moneybags and by the possessor of labor power, we therefore take leave for a time of this noisy sphere where everything takes place on the surface and in view of all men, and follow them both into the hidden abode of production, on whose threshold there stares us in the face no admittance except on business. Here we shall see not only how capital produces, but how capital is produced. We shall at last force the secret of profit making, right? So the capitalist buys labor power in circulation, but uses it someplace else, right? And that someplace else is restrictive, right? And it's something that's not really considered in bourgeois political economy. The sphere we're deserting, where this, you know, is a very Eden of the rights of man. There alone rule freedom, equality, property, and bentham, right? So freedom in circulation, both the worker and the capitalist are free, right? Nobody is forcing another to buy or sell. There's equality because they both own commodities, right? And they're exchanging equivalents. And benthams is a reference to Jeremy Bentham, because they're only looking out for their own private interests, right? I'm selling my labor power because I need money, and they're buying my labor power because they need to produce value, right? So we're each sort of like self-interested. When we enter the workplace, it's very different, right? So Mr. Moneybags is now the capitalist, and the worker is his worker, right? Bringing their own hide to market and has nothing to expect but a hiding. All right, so chapter 7, the labor process and the process of producing surplus value. So labor in the general sense, right, at a sort of very high level of abstraction. It's a process between nature and people, acting on the external world and changing it, and then thus also changing ourselves, right? So it's a dialectical relationship between people and the world. There's 3 components of the labor process: labor, the subject, what we're working on, and the instruments of production, right? Or the means of production, raw materials, auxiliary materials are those like energy, instruments, machinery, and then labor power. The means of production are products of previous labor power, so their value is determined by the socially necessary labor time required for their production. Productive consumption is that which takes place during the creation of capital. So when I work a machine to produce value, I'm consuming it, but in a productive way because I'm actually producing it, right? And I'm also maintaining its value, but we'll get to that later. Under capitalism, right, Mr. Moneybags controls this whole process, and the product is owned by Mr. Moneybags, right? It's all his property. The capitalist is buying all of these things at their value, right? The worker uses the means of production and bringing them to life to create new value. But where does this new value come from? The past labor that's embodied in the labor power and, and the living labor that it can call into action, the daily cost of maintaining it and its daily expenditure and work are two totally different things, right? The former determines the exchange value of labor power, the latter is its use value. So this all hinges on that distinction, right? Therefore, the value of labor power and the value which that labor power creates in the labor process are two entirely different magnitudes. And this difference of the two values was what the capitalist had in view when he was purchasing the labor power, right? So in other words, surplus value comes from the difference between the value of labor power, represented as the wage, and the use value of labor power, what it does in the production process. As such, it's totally consistent with the eternal laws of the market, the exchange of equivalents. Note in the first footnote on the last page of this chapter, Marx addresses the distinction between skilled and unskilled labor and how it doesn't impact the existence of surplus value, although it can impact the rate of surplus value. And he says that this is kind of self-evident. So basically, you know, yeah, there's skilled labor, which has a different higher value maybe than unskilled labor, which has a lower value. He just says like, okay, we're just gonna assume unskilled labor, and then we're just gonna take skilled labor to be like, you know, a quantitative ratio of that. So like, you know, 1 hour of skilled labor equals 2 hours, or 1 hour of unskilled labor equals 2 hours of skilled labor, for example. There's obviously problems with this. I mean, Marx is just like, well, it's like, we should just assume it. It's, you know, we see it all the time. I think in many ways that, you know, that seems to make sense for me, although I think there's a lot of economists who have, I mean, it does pose difficulties, the simplicity of it does. But, you know, Marx isn't really interested in that here. It doesn't do anything to the argument as a whole. It's just sort of a further realm to explore. All right, and then we're on to chapter 8, constant capital and variable capital. So the worker preserves value and creates value in the production process, right? The means of production don't create any value. Their value is transferred to the finished commodity. It creates a new use value without a new exchange value, right? So when the cotton is spun into the coat, it's a new use value, but the exchange value is just that, what the cotton had previously. Right? Value is a dynamic social relation, so the value of the MOP can decrease and technically increase as well after Moneybags bought them, right? So if I buy, you know, all the machines for $1,000 a piece, and they're going to last me 10 years, but then the next year, the socially necessary labor time that goes into them decreases, and so, you know, I don't know, maybe they're $500 now, right? And so this is why capital, one of the reasons why capital wants to create as fast as possible, because you can't predict when these innovations are going to come, right? And so you want to just use it up as fast as you can so that you can get as much value out of it as you can, right? It also is why there's a lot of like renting of machinery that takes place, because then you can sort of transfer that responsibility onto somebody else. Because the use value of labor power is independent from its exchange value, if the productivity of labor is increased, more surplus value is produced, right? So if the worker is forced to work harder, they'll create more surplus value. So constant capital, the capital remains constant in the production process. Variable capital, it's variable, it changes. in the production process, right? The worker has to work faster, more is produced. If the worker refuses to and works more slowly, less is produced. So it's variable because it varies, right? So constant capital is means of production, raw materials. Variable capital is labor power. Then we get to the rate of surplus value. So capital in this book is composed of means of production and labor power. And we get some more definitions. Necessary labor is the time spent reproducing the value of labor power, wage or variable capital. Surplus labor is a time beyond necessary labor, right? So you work a 10-hour day, and many times you can calculate this, right? Like how many commodities have you produced? How many whatever have you sold or have you made? How many services have you performed? And you know what the boss is selling them for, right? So at what point have you basically worked to pay your own wage? And then what point beyond that are you working then purely for the capitalist? This is the distinction, right? The working day is always divided between necessary labor and surplus labor. And it doesn't matter how long it is, right? If you work for like 10 minutes, you're going to be, part of that will be necessary and part of that will be surplus. So don't get confused between necessary labor and socially necessary labor time. Socially necessary labor time is a sort of aggregate that it takes to produce one commodity under average conditions, skills, et cetera, et cetera. Necessary labor is the time during the worker reproduces their wage. And the rate of surplus value is surplus labor over variable capital, right? Or necessary labor, S over V. And this disproves Signor's last hour argument. So Signor is saying like, well, if you reduce the working day to 10 hours, all the capitalists make their profit in hours 11 and 12. So there's going to be no profit. But surplus value is a rate. So that means that it's taking place all the time, right? Both necessary labor and surplus labor sort of glide into each other. There's not like, a distinction between them. So even if the working day was 4 hours, right, under capitalism, there would still be surplus labor taking place, right? And then the rate of profit is different. The rate of profit takes into account constant capital, right? So means of production and raw materials. So the rate of surplus value will generally be higher because because the denominator will be lower, right? I think that's right. That's why it is. Because but the rate of profit is really what the capitalist is concerned with. But the worker, we're really concerned with the rate of surplus value, right? So those are two different sort of class viewpoints of the same thing. The capitalist is only concerned with the rate of profit. And Marx is going to go into this more in depth in later volumes because this will also include like, rent, taxes, and other things. And you should try to calculate like the rate of exploitation, which is the rate of surplus value that you've had at a job, and see if you can do that, right? And it's a very good agitational tool because once you figure that out, you can talk to your workers, right, and be like, oh, how many of this have you sold in the last 2 hours, right? And then like, oh, how much money is that, and then, oh, what's your wage, right? So and what's the difference there? It's a very like sort of straightforward, transparent, agitational illustration of exploitation, which isn't this sort of, weird nebulous concept. It's a very concrete thing that we do day in and day out. So I think that's going to be it for this class. For next class, we're going to be reading chapters 10 through 14, and we'll get more concrete with the concepts. We're really going to get into the history of class struggle. Again, Marx is writing about England at this time, and we'll be looking more about how it is that the use value of labor power is consumed, under what conditions, how do workers resist it, how do capitalists resist workers' resistance, and so on and so forth. So chapter 10 it's really, really good. There's a lot of testimonies from factory inspectors, and then chapters 11 through 14 are shorter. They sort of get back more into like the rate of surplus value and that kind of thing, right? We'll see some more equations or whatever. So thanks so much, everybody. for this class. And as always, let me know if, if you have any questions, and if you can't stay after for a question and for discussion time, you can always email